So in our last talk, we saw how Dworkin is one of those who believes that if I can get down at the root idea of what justice is, which is at the center of agreement in the whole debate over economic distribution, if I can get down at the root concept that everyone agrees on, then I can set up a picture of justice that will make both liberty and equality central and not favor one over the other. Well, how is that possible? Well, he says, look, when you look at the concept of justice, you see that every concept in the debate presently, going back to Aristotle, assumes one thing about human beings and what capacity they have to have in order for there to be a such thing as justice. And that capacity is the capacity to choose for themselves, to be morally autonomous individuals. He calls that moral responsibility. So in other words, no matter what you think of is central to justice, what is presupposed in it is this notion of choice or responsibility. To see that, think about when we accuse someone of being unjust. What are we accusing them of being? We're accusing them of being responsible for hurting others in some sense, harming them. Or let's say we think of a person who is just and fair. We attribute to them a virtue, don't we? A virtue which is praiseworthy and which therefore is something which we assume when we praise them that they are responsible for. So thus the central concept that's assumed in all versions of justice, no matter how we work it out further, is this notion of responsibility. Now if you notice, and I wrote on the board responsibility, I divided it into two words, which really it's the combination of response and ability. In other words, responsibility is both an individual and a collective notion, Dworkin will say. It has the idea of that when I am responsible, that I am responding or am responsive to other people. I'm not just an individual. I cannot be just on a deserted island where I live alone. There's no responsibility there because there's no one to be responsible to. And so thus, responsibility has within the notion of my choice that I recognize that there are consequences to my choices and that my choices affect not just myself and my future, but other people, other choosers. But on the other hand, it has this notion of ability in it, right? That choice is a power, an individual power that I have in controlling my life and the life of other people. And so these two concepts within responsibility, he says, are what work out to these two notions within justice. These two notions that he says are assumed in justice. And that is that justice has the concept of equal concern and equal respect. That everyone deserves, in a just society, equal concern from the society and equal respect. Now, what is that equal concern? Equal concern is the working out of that notion of responsiveness to others and recognition of the consequences of my choices on others. It recognizes that I am no more entitled to the concern of society than anyone else. That everyone deserves equal concern from the government and society. In other words, that the fate of each individual should be equally important to everybody in society. And you might say that's what grounds the idea of equality in notions of justice in progressive liberalism. But remember, responsibility is autonomy. It is also, therefore, a uniquely individual notion about my powers and how those powers should be set free and not curtailed. So this involves the notion of freedom, I cannot be truly responsible unless I am in control of my own decisions, and especially in control of my decisions about what counts as a good life, as a successful life. So everyone in a just society is one that should be equally free to determine for themselves what counts as a successful life. Now you might see a contradiction here in that this in itself should be part of the good life, right? Justice. And so if everybody should be free to determine what counts as a good life, then what should prevent Hitler from determining that a good life is a totalitarian life, a life that restricts the freedom of everybody else but me? Well, that, he says, is consistent with what he's saying. Because just because I should be free to determine for myself what that good life is, doesn't mean that my determination is correct. You see, all concepts of moral goodness or justice or good life depend on that I freely choose it. In other words, that I willingly do the good. So in other words, if I'm forced to be benevolent, then I'm not being benevolent because I like it, because I believe it's part of what it is to be a good person. And so therefore I'm not really benevolent, am I? I must do it willingly, which means that all concepts of what a good life will be will assume that in order for me to fulfill that I'm responsible for it, and therefore assume that respect, assume that everyone should be free to determine it for themselves. Otherwise, it's not really good. So there's no conflict there. It's not saying because everyone is free to determine what the good life is, that therefore everybody is right, or that one person is right and the other is wrong. Remember, skepticism is no option. It's just that no concept that's valuable to us about what makes a good person is one where that person is forced to believe that this is good. So thus we see that the central notion behind justice is responsibility, and that responsibility has these twin horns to them: equality of concern and equality of respect. Equality and liberty. So then the question is, well, how do I reconcile these two, you might say? How they seem to be coming from the same source. Does that mean that moral responsibility is a chimerical notion, a contradiction in terms, like military intelligence? No. What we have to do, if we're going to show that there's a right answer, is we have to come up with a kind of society that is able to maximize both equal concern and equal respect without sacrificing one over the other. If we can do that, then we can show that these notions are not inherently in conflict, and that our notion of justice can be worked out in a real social way. So, but you might ask the question before we get to that is, well, why should I take this notion of moral responsibility as central to justice? And why should I take that therefore there should be equal concern and equal respect? In other words, if everything is about my choices, different people make different choices and therefore deserve different things, don't they? So why would this lead to equal concern or equal respect? Shouldn't it be, as Aristotle said, the situation where people are going to get the level of respect they deserve, and that might be different, and people are going to get the level of concern they deserve because they contribute differently to society, and some contribute more to society than others, and therefore maybe justice, which is still founded on moral responsibility and still respects the idea that it's others and self, will see equality as not what we get, but actually different levels of concern based on desert, and different levels of respect based on merit. So now, this is where, when you're reading the article on equality of resources, that first page is essential. What he's got to do is picture human life and its foundation in a way that makes sense of this picture of justice. In there, he says this. He says, let's picture life like this. Suppose a number of shipwreck survivors are washed up on a desert island, which has abundant resources and no native population. These immigrants accept the principle that no one is antecedently entitled to any of these resources. Now this is crucial because what he's working out here is a picture of our original position, right? In other words, how each of us start human life. And he's saying each of us start on an equal playing field in this sense, is that none of the circumstances of our life that we start with, okay, are a product of our choices. Okay? In other words, that every one of us is like that immigrant to this desert island. Okay? Now think about the desert island. The desert island, no one owns anything originally, right? They're coming upon an island that's very fruitful, has a lot of resources, but there's no one living there already, so no one has any antecedent right to the property. And everyone in the shipwreck, all of the immigrants we'll call them, are such that none of them themselves have any particular claim to the resources on the island. Then aren't they all in an equal position? No one can claim what? That they have more of a right to the property there than anybody else. Okay? So now you and I, when we're born, are in that position. We didn't earn any of our natural endowments. Those are circumstantial. We didn't earn our position in society. We didn't earn our parents. We didn't earn any of it. None of this, when we are born, is a product of our choice. At least if you're not Hindu or Buddhist. But he's assuming that we all agree about that. That this life is our first one, and perhaps our last. And so, given that presupposition, then it follows that none of us come into this life with an inherent right to any of the goods of this life above and beyond anybody else. Now, what is he considering the goods or resources of our life? He's considering them all the circumstances that are not under our control, which makes sense, again, of this notion of justice as responsibility, because we're asking the question, what is a fair or just distribution of property, of resources? And what are those resources? Well, just the things that are not under my control. But when I'm born, nothing was under my control. And therefore, I'm as if I'm like that immigrant among other immigrants to this island, Earth, and all of its possible resources. Since none of us are, therefore, more entitled to any of the resources than others, then rationally speaking, we all have equal entitlement, don't we? And therefore, we all therefore are entitled to equal concern and equal respect. Equal division of everyone. Society should devote the same amount of resources to you as it devotes to me, because you and I are just like two different shipwrecked immigrants to Earth. And there's no way of saying that you have more of a right to this stuff than I do. But also, society should respect my decisions about what I'm going to count as a successful life, simply because if it doesn't, then it is showing that it's saying one person's choices are more important than another person's choices. And it is also saying that one person's choices are antecedently right without deliberation. But you can't do that. You can't say who's right or wrong until there's an equal playing field called rational debate. And so we see, therefore, the basis for what he considers economic justice. If everyone is entitled to equal concern, right, and equal respect, then we have to come up with a society that devotes the same amount of resources to each person in society and their life. That's the first thing. But the way the society distributes the resources has to be such that it respects the personal ambitions of each person in society, so that the distribution that's equal doesn't conflict with the choices that everyone makes about what it is ultimately to be successful in life. So in this article, The Distribution Equality of Resources, he says that this is the way to go, and that this will make both of these concepts coherent and cohere with each other. And the key will be in a certain type of free market economy. This is essential because what you see here is, in one sense, he's siding with people like Adam Smith and saying central to the concept of uniting these two seemingly conflicting notions is actually building into the original position, the ideal rational deliberation, a kind of market. A kind of market that allows for equal distribution of resources that respects both equality of concern and equality of respect.